It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Jennifer Saul from the University of Sheffield. She works in the philosophy of language and also on feminism, and has finished the book on language and ethics, mainly on lying. Lying and misleading, the differences between the two, I take it. But she's also director of the Implicit Bias Project at Sheffield, and today she'll talk to us, despite my slightly misleading title, on why philosophy matters to implicit bias. So over to you.
Oh, thanks. It's also why implicit bias matters, but that's the easy part. Okay, thanks for having me. What I'm going to do in this talk is, quite briefly and in broad brushstrokes, I'll be presenting some quite disturbing results from psychology that seem to show ways in which pretty much all human beings are often unknowingly prone to prejudices and certain sorts of very disturbing errors. Then I'll turn to the philosophy. And I decided that the best way to show you how philosophy matters to implicit bias would be to do brief presentations of how philosophy matters to implicit bias in three different ways, how philosophy can help us to make sense of the implications of these very disturbing findings. So I'll be doing that by looking at issues of blame, issues of skepticism, issues of affirmative action. Okay. So, implicit bias is a term that is, like many terms of philosophy, in fact, very hard to define. What I'm concerned with is implicit biases that are largely unconscious, automatic associations that we make with certain social groups that lead us to, that affect the ways that we judge, evaluate, and interact with people who are members of those social groups, and I'm particularly concerned with social groups that are stigmatized in our societies. Which groups those are will vary from society to society, and what the associations are will vary from society to society. And what psychologists have been showing is that the overwhelming majority of people are, in one way or another, prone to what can be described as unconscious biases against those groups that are stigmatized in their society. Now, these biases, it's worth pausing a moment to ask you, why would we have these? They seem, what's thought is that these arise from a general tendency that human beings have, which is really a very, very useful tendency to make fast associations and act on the basis of those associations. This is why when I see a fire, I don't look at it and think, orange. That's a nice color. I wonder what it's like. Oh, it's a little bit warm. Maybe I shouldn't touch it. I don't do that. I just jump back. And that's a great thing. That's very helpful for obvious reasons. It becomes less helpful when the associations are with social groups, and it in fact has some quite disturbing effects. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of the best known way that psychologists have studied implicit biases, but it's by far not the only one. There are many other ones as well. The best known test of implicit biases is what's called the implicit association test. The reason this is so well known is because you can go home tonight, get on the internet, and take some of these tests yourself and find out about your unconscious associations. The way it works is that you're asked to make very quick judgments, trying to pair, you're sitting at a keyboard like this, pairing, for example, black and white faces with positive and negative adjectives, and they find that people in general are much faster to pair the black faces with the negative adjectives than with the positive ones, much better at doing that. And they've done this for all sorts of different social categories and all sorts of different associations. Now, if you want to try some of these, and I urge you to do it, it'll give you a very disturbing evening. They'll probably give your friends and families disturbing evenings as you tell them to go do it as well. What you should do is Google Project Implicit, which will take you to a website run by Harvard. It's very important that you choose the implicit association tests that are the right ones for your country whatever that is. Not the country that you're living in, but the country that you feel most culturally associated with. Because otherwise the default will be U.S. ones, and you'll get names of U.S. politicians, and you'll get U.S. categories, and how people are categorized will differ from country to country. So you should select your own. Okay. Now, some important things about these. They're often, it's very important to emphasize this, they're often contrary. One of the reasons it's such a disturbing experience is that they're often contrary to genuine, deeply held egalitarian commitments. If you were actually, a full-blooded, happy racist, you wouldn't be disturbed to find out that you're faster to associate black faces with bad adjectives, because that's what you think you are, right? But they're, for most of us, contrary to genuine, deeply held convictions. And they can be held even by members of the group that are targeted by them. And that's why I have a picture here of Jesse Jackson, because he tells an anecdote which I think can be well understood as an anecdote of an implicit bias rising up to consciousness so that he becomes aware of it. He says that he is, I should mention, a very well-known African-American civil rights activist who's devoted his life to fighting racism. And he says one of the most disturbing experiences he's had is realizing that if he's in an unfamiliar city late at night walking down the street, he hears footsteps behind him and feels nervous. Then he turns around, and when he sees it's a white man, he feels relieved. And it's not that Jesse Jackson consciously believes that black men are dangerous, right? In fact, he's devoted his life to fighting that belief. But even he is affected by the associations that are present in the society that he lives in. So, as I said, you can try some of these tests yourself. Okay? Now, these are not things that just show up on tests. I'm going to quite quickly go through a few ways that they seem to manifest themselves in actual behaviors in the world. So, in teaching, both men and women are more likely to call on male students than female students. When a student makes one of those inchoate, semi-incoherent comments where you can't quite tell whether they're trying to get at something really interesting or they're just filling time by saying stuff, lecturers are more likely, both men and women, to charitably interpret the inchoate contributions of men and think they're getting at something interesting, and more likely to think the women are just confused. Not just in teaching situations, but in many situations, as often discussed in the business world, a woman makes a point at a group discussion, the discussion goes on without noticing it, and then a man makes the same point, and it gets taken up as a great point and embraced. Okay, so, again, this is a thing that seems to be true both men and women. They're more likely to take a point that a woman raised seriously if it's then restated by a man. We do have some chairs over here if you want to.
Some here.
Implicit bias is a good part of the reason that the UK has the wonderful practice of anonymous marking, which is totally unheard of in North America. I was recently asked on a visit to a North American university to do an hour-long session on how to do anonymous marking because nobody could figure out how this could possibly work. I said, I can do 5 minutes, maybe tell you some general stuff about implicit bias. Anonymous marking leads to higher marks for women. And again, the most likely explanation of this is implicit bias at work. Letters of reference for men and women are very different. Studies have shown they tend to use different kinds of adjectives. There are certain kinds of adjectives that tend to be more associated with men. I'll tell you what the ones are with references and you'll see the pattern here. Okay, so men get adjectives like brilliant, outstanding, and original, which are exactly the kinds of adjectives that make you want to hire someone. Right? This is somebody really active and great. Women are described as working hard, being friendly, being surprisingly successful, very attractive, And this is a great one. It's a real one from the study. Friends with my wife. The totally relevant stuff gets put there in the female letters of reference, in addition to quite a lot of doubt raisers, like surprisingly successful, and things having to do with just being, a good sort who plugs on and doesn't give up and works very hard, and a good citizen, whereas men are the ones who are brilliant and outstanding and original. Whenever I give this talk, there are always some people who go off and look at the letters of reference that they have written. They look back at their letters and they realize, and this is both men and women, and it includes me, that they do this too. It's not that I was saying my female students were friends with my wife or telling them about how attractive they were, but I was more likely to talk about my female students being friendly than my male students. I didn't realize I was doing it, but friendliness and the sort of community spirit is the sort of thing that's gendered female and associated with women, considered a good thing for women to be, and it's going to leap to mind more easily when we're thinking about women. With the best will in the world, this can happen. So lots of people are now becoming a lot more conscious of how they write their letters of reference. Okay. Now, if it will let me go on to the next slide, I will. Okay. Women have particular problems being perceived as leaders. And I mean that quite literally. So if you give people a photograph like this and ask them who is the leader in the room, 100% of them will pick the white guy at the head of the table. If you give them this photograph, only 50% of them pick the woman at the head of the table. So even being perceived as the leader is a hurdle that a woman has to clear in a leadership position. Just even with the full trappings of leadership, of being at the head of the table, with people looking at her like a leader, she still isn't the leader for 50% of the people. It's not very surprising. I think that this shows up in hiring. What's surprising is how beautifully, clearly it's been demonstrated. So there were lots of studies psychologists have done where they take exactly the same CV and vary what name is at the top of it. With a male name at the top of the CV, it's considered a better CV. The person is more likely to be invited to interview, offered a higher salary, more likely to be offered a higher rank. Same thing is true with a white-sounding name versus a non-white-sounding name. And interestingly, they've also done studies which require a slight tweak to the standard model, where they add an indication of parenthood. So what they do is they take exactly the same CV and then add on to an additional accomplishment, which is president of the Parent-Teacher Association. This is an additional leadership role. Somebody's done all of that, plus run the Parent-Teacher Association. It sends the male CV to the top of the pile and sends the female CV to the bottom of the pile. Now, you might like to think, and everybody would like to think, that this is just going to die out. That surely, this has been happening, but the people with these attitudes, they'll be retiring soon. The rest of us are fine. The most recent study of this was 2012, so it is not an old study. And the most disturbing result from this is that this was a study of scientists, and it was hiring somebody with a male name versus a female name, so it's a study of gender. The effect was equally strong for both men and women, and I think this is the really creepy thing, it was equally strong at all ages. So the younger people were just as prone to these biases as the older people. There's been a lot of interesting discussion of citation recently. Some of you from philosophy departments may be aware of Kieran Healy's study of citation in philosophy, which seemed to show very strong male bias. Even more recently than that, there's a study in international relations where they controlled for all sorts of things having to do with kind of research, kind of university, level of rank, all these sorts of things, and they found that the average paper by an untenured male was cited 26.7 times, and the average paper by a female at the same level, at the same university, would be cited 2.15 times. There's a very strong bias in favor of citing men. And this is very likely to be due to implicit bias, which has the effect that when you sit down to write the paper and you think, who are the names that I need to mention on this? Where were the big people in the field? The male names will leap to mind more easily. Another favorite study of mine is a study of prestige bias. And I'm especially interested in prestige bias because prestige bias, which I'm about to explain, shows people making mistakes on things that they're experts on. So, in prestige bias, in this study, what they did was they took papers that had been published already in top psychology journals and they resubmitted them to top psychology journals with fake names and fake unprestigious affiliations. What happened was that 90% of them were rejected. And they weren't rejected because we've published that before. Nobody noticed that, which is in itself a disturbing fact. Right? They were rejected for serious methodological errors other than plagiarism. Right? And I think this is a really fascinating one. I think it's fascinating because these are people making decisions about the thing that they're most expert about, the methodology of their own field, and they're being led seriously astray by the prestige of the institution. Okay. Now, I've focused on the way these things manifest themselves in academia, but that's only a tiny, tiny part of the picture. Academia is only a tiny part of the world. I mean, some of this is broader, hiring things that aren't just about academia, but it's important to realize the effects of this go well beyond that, and they're far more horrible. Study that shows that, well, lots of studies showing this, are studies of what's called shooter bias, where they give people, the people are playing a sort of video game, and they're presented with images like this quite quickly, where you can't quite see what the object is that he has in his hand, whether it's a phone or a gun. And they vary the race of the person that is being shown. And your task is to shoot really quickly if the person's carrying a gun and not shoot them if they're not carrying a gun. And people are far more likely to shoot a black person carrying a harmless object than a white person carrying a harmless object. This study was inspired by a horrendous incident, among many horrendous incidents, but the particular one that inspired it was the shooting of Amadou Diallo in New York, who was a black man reaching for his wallet when he was shot over 50 times by the New York City police. And the police said we thought it was a gun, and they may well have thought it was a gun because we have biases which make us make these horrible sorts of errors. They may not have. I don't know what the case is about that actual case. So I now want to turn to, I've talked about what these biases are, and hopefully this makes you think one should do something about this. We don't want to just go on in the world being biased this way. It's a problem. It's not so obvious what to do about these things. The first things you think of to do aren't, in fact, the right ones. So I'm going to start with what not to do. Very popular thing to do is to say, right, I don't want to be biased. I will tell myself, don't be biased. I will not be biased. And it used to be that when I talked to editors of journals and tried to suggest more use of anonymous review or anonymous editing, they'd say, no, I can just tell myself not to be biased and I won't be biased. Turns out that can backfire and make it worse. Absolutely don't. You might think that something to do would be to think about some time in the past when you got it right and you managed to be unbiased. Well, first of all, you don't really know that you did. But even if you could know that, it turns out that reflecting approvingly on some time that you got it right will make you worse. Don't tell yourself not to see gender and race. It's a super popular thing to say. This isn't a problem for me because I don't see gender, I don't see race, and therefore I'm a good person. It backfires. If somebody says they don't see gender, don't see race, those are the ones to be really suspicious of. Along with everybody else. So another thing that doesn't do what it's supposed to is probably the most popular thing institutionally, I say this as a veteran of 50, 60 hiring committees, which is you put a woman on your hiring committee so that you can make it gender fair. And that's not going to help you very much with implicit bias, unless you get incredibly lucky. Women, like men, are very likely to hold biases against women. Remember that CV study showed the same effect for women and men. So it's probably not going to help with implicit bias. Even if you managed to get a woman on there who wasn't prone to implicit bias, that probably wouldn't make a difference for your committee. Because remember, women have trouble getting their voices heard and get trouble being taken seriously and have trouble having their points heard. So you put one woman on that committee. Even if she's right about it, it's not so clear she's going to sway things. Now, having a woman on a hiring committee can help with certain other issues. I'm not going to go into. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. But again, one woman probably won't be enough to do the job. Now, what does work, what works beautifully when you can do it, is anonymizing. And I have a picture here of, in fact, my cousin Gail. And my cousin Gail spent a decade unemployed trying to get a job in an orchestra in the United States. And then quite a lot of orchestras decided to start holding auditions behind screens so that you couldn't see the musician auditioning. And that was when Gail got her first job with the Chicago Symphony. And she wasn't alone in this. There was a huge rise in the number of women getting jobs in orchestras once they started auditioning behind a screen. And that's why anonymous marking is such a good thing. Now, obviously, you can't anonymize everything. You can't have somebody, if you want to hire a lecturer and see how they are as a lecturer, you can't put them behind a screen and see what their lecture's like, and maybe use a voice distorter so you can't hear their voice. I mean, this is not a good test of lecture. But you can anonymize parts of a process, right? You could anonymize the long listing phase, which is basically done on the basis of their publications. You could circulate anonymized writing samples for the department to read of the long listed candidates and get their feedback on those samples before going on to the next one. So it's worth thinking about ways that things can be anonymized, even partly, because anonymizing is great when it works, because it means you don't have a chance to be biased against the social group because you have no idea what the social group is. Another thing that seems to help is spending some time thinking about a counter-stereotypical exemplar, which is a person who's a member of the stigmatized group who doesn't fit the stereotype of the group. I'm very excited that when you go through customs at most American airports now, the first thing that you see is a picture like that. Right? So I think this kind of thing may make a difference gradually. It has been shown that spending a few minutes looking at a picture like this or a picture of Martin Luther King before taking the race IAT will change your results on the race IAT. Now, obviously, it's better and it's more effective and better in lots of ways to not just look at a picture for a few minutes every now and then. It's better to live surrounded by counter-stereotypical exemplars. And there are lots of ways to do that. Obviously, I think, I should say, my field is philosophy, as you know, and philosophy, as you may or may not know, depending on whether you're a philosopher, is, depending on the country, about 75 to 80% male. This is totally at odds with the picture for the rest of the arts and humanities. The arts and humanities subjects tend to be close to parity. It looks much more like one of the sciences. In fact, it looks worse than most of the sciences. There are studies that seem to show philosophy even more male than maths, which is your paradigm case of a male subject. So philosophy's got this issue, and obviously one thing to do is to hire more women. But in addition to that, you can put women on your reading lists. You can invite women to come speak. You can put their pictures up on the walls along with the pictures of the famous male philosophers. Right, so there are lots of ways of adding in these counter-stereotypical exemplars and changing the environment you're in. And now we come to my very favorite thing that works. I was so excited when I found out about this. Amazingly, ingesting glucose makes you behave in less biased ways. Fabulous. Every job committee needs to have a tray like that. More generally, if you're hungry and tired and rushed, the implicit bias will manifest more. So you should try to avoid being hungry, tired, and rushed, which, of course, is easier said than done. But you can think about how the hiring is structured. I was recently on a very high-level hiring committee at my university where they were supposedly extremely concerned about implicit bias, and they showed this in lots of ways. I mean, they had everyone go to 2-hour implicit bias briefings. They did all kinds of stuff. But when they sent me the CVs to look at for shortlisting, they sent them to me at 6 o'clock at night before a meeting at noon the next day. And that was the email in which they told me the meeting was going to be at noon the next day. Right? And so with the best will in the world, they tried to do everything right, but they didn't get enough time for the process. And they could have extended the process enough to, they could have given us a week. A week never makes that much difference, right? So there are things you can do. Okay. Other things that help, if you're hiring, you want to agree on the criteria in advance. The reason for this is that psychologists have found if you don't do that, then what the criteria you care about will shift. If you want to agree on the criteria and they're weighting. So, for example, if you've got a job, this is what one of the ones they're saying, you've got a job where both experience and qualifications matter. What they found is that if the female candidate was the one with the experience, suddenly qualifications were the most important thing. If the male candidate was the one with the experience, then the experience was the most important thing. And people were shifting that without being aware that they were shifting that. So that's why you want to agree on the criteria and they're weighting in advance. You may want to not put too much weight on any one thing. In philosophy, it's pretty standard that the most important thing is the job talk, which occurs at the end of the process. But there are all kinds of ways that the job talk may not, in fact, be manifesting the candidate's traits most fully. And I don't have time to discuss stereotype threat, so I won't be going into that. But there's no reason that the job talk should be weighted more heavily than the publication record, showing what the candidate has already managed to accomplish. It's important to get feedback on each element as you go in order to avoid an overall gestalt evaluation, because that's likely to be more biased than very specific things. Another thing that helps, it's very depressing, but it seems to work, is spending some time thinking about past occasions when you in fact behaved in a biased way that seems to activate your motivation to control bias in an unconscious way. So little things you can do. You can try harder to notice when a woman's student wants to speak. If a woman's comment is being ignored or attributed to someone else, you can say, hey, that's what Sally said. You can think about how you run your discussions instead of calling on the highest prestige person in the room and letting them ask a 17-part question. You can try to get as many different voices in as possible. You can re-examine your letters of reference for gendered content. Are you tending to describe men and women in different ways? And you can, of course, cite women in your papers, which is actually a really lovely, easy thing to do. Because, if you're trying to decide who to hire or who to invite to speak at your seminar, if you have this woman, then you might have to get rid of somebody else you're interested in. But if you're deciding who to cite, you can just add in all the ones you want. Right? There's no limit on that. Now I'm going to turn to the philosophy. It is coming. So the first of the three things I want to discuss here is blame, which is an issue that immediately leaps to mind when you think about this, because what you learn when you learn about this is that we are all very likely to be influenced in quite horrible ways by racist biases, sexist biases, lots of biases that we find abhorrent. We are likely to be acting in ways that have very powerful effects on other people and perhaps on ourselves, and that help to perpetuate the racism and sexism and other injustices in the world. Because if you're acting on this basis and it's affecting who you hire and how you interact with people, that helps to maintain the current situation. And this behavior is unfair. I think that's pretty patently obvious from what I've described. This is why it's really easy to say why implicit bias matters. Right? Because it's doing this really bad stuff in the world. So it might look at first like we are just terribly blameworthy. We're all horrible people and should go home and think about how terribly racist and sexist we are. There's something to it. But on the other hand, before you learn about the existence of implicit bias, you may well have no idea that this is going on. You might have no idea that you're prone to these biases and that they're affecting your behavior. And these biases may be contrary to these genuine, deeply held egalitarian commitments you have. Moreover, before you learn not just about the biases, but about some of the techniques for dealing with them, some of which are pretty strange, you don't know how to control them. Right? So all of that might seem to suggest, wait, you're not blameworthy for it. So you shouldn't feel so bad. But philosophers always complicate the picture. And that's a bit too fast to move just to that conclusion, although I've been very tempted by it. We can easily be held blameworthy for things we're not aware of. If I'm driving completely drunk and I run over a small child, it doesn't absolve me of blame to say, I wasn't aware of it. I didn't see the kid. That doesn't help. Right? Doesn't make me less blameworthy. And we can be blameworthy for actions that are contrary to genuine, deeply held convictions as well. Suppose I do run over a child while drunk. I probably also think it's bad to run over children while drunk, or in any state of mind. Right? I genuinely believe it's bad. It's contrary to my genuine commitment, but I'm still blameworthy for it. And we can be held blameworthy for things we don't know how to control. Maybe I'm habitually late, and I've tried to do something about it. I can't figure out what to do. Nothing I try works. That doesn't make me not blameworthy for being late all the time. So none of these on its own really absolves from blame. Now what I'd like to be able to say, and I haven't had a chance to develop this properly, is that implicit biases, before we know about them, and I mean that quite broadly, not just that we have to know about our own, but just knowing that they exist and we're likely to have them. Before that, sometimes we've got a special combination of these things. Quite a lot of the time we may have this. We're not aware of the implicit biases or even of the existence of implicit bias. We're not aware that human beings are prone to this. We've got these genuine contrary commitments, and we don't know how to control it. Put all three of those things together, and perhaps that combination means we're not morally responsible. But things change once we know that we're likely to be biased. And once we know what to do about it, then we become blameworthy if we don't try to do something about it. If we just go on about our business and say, oh yeah, probably I'm doing all that stuff that has these terrible effects in the world, then we're blameworthy. And this is where I tend to apologize to my audience, because you may well have entered this room blameless. But now you know these horrible facts about human nature. So I do think that once we become aware of our likely biases and how to control them, we're blameworthy if we don't take action. Another point I want to make here that I don't have time to go into is that I think another place where philosophy matters here to blame is that we need different vocabulary. Terms like racist and sexist are awfully crude. And we need to develop subtler terms to make the subtle distinctions here between the various levels of culpability. Now I'm going to turn to a different way that philosophy matters. And this is the way that philosophy matters to our knowledge. I think implicit bias perhaps gives rise to something that's akin to a kind of skepticism. So, here's how it goes. I want to remind you of the prestige bias example where the psychologists judge the papers published in top journals to be unpublishable because they have unprestigious affiliations. Well, I mean, they're not aware that that's why they're making the judgment, but it tracks that. When those psychologists are making those mistakes, they're making mistakes about their area of expertise, the methodology of their own subject. And their evaluations are being influenced by totally irrelevant things. They don't think they're evaluating the institution that the person came from. They think they're evaluating the experimental methodology. They think it would be totally wrong to evaluate the paper on the basis of the institution rather than the methodology. So they're being influenced by things that they think they shouldn't be influenced by. And all of that's happening without them being aware that that's happening. They think they're evaluating the methodology, and they think that's the only thing they're evaluating. They think that's the only thing influencing their judgments. And I think this shows us something incredibly disturbing. Now, you might think, it's not disturbing. We know we make mistakes. This is just what people are like. It's part of our self-conception. We know we make mistakes. We know that most of the things that we now believe as scientific fact will be overturned eventually. This is part of what we know about human beings. But I want to insist that mistakes like these aren't part of our self-conception. This is people making mistakes of a very specific sort. They're making errors about the nature of their judgment. They're making errors about their own field of expertise. And these are judgments that they're very confident of, probably some of the ones they're most confident of. It's not like they're trying to figure out what they're seeing through a haze. It's not like they're trying to add up some very large sums in their head and they know they're not very good at that. They're evaluating the methodology of their own field. And presumably they're doing this under relatively ideal circumstances. I imagine very few of them are drunk while they're doing it or asleep, right? They're wide awake evaluating the methodology of their own field. That's why I think there's something really disturbing that we can get out of this. So, traditional skeptical arguments work by getting us to think about some possibility that we can't rule out, which makes us think we could be in error. And that's supposed to move us to wonder whether perhaps we don't really know that anything in the external world is real. So, for example, maybe all of this is a dream rather than reality. Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat being stimulated by a computer and I'm imagining all these things taking place. These are the kinds of things that philosophers use to generate skeptical scenarios. And the idea is once you consider this possibility and discover you can't rule it out, that's a threat to knowledge. Now, philosophers, in fact, don't tend to embrace that conclusion, but that's the way the traditional skepticism works. And it doesn't really worry anyone. A key reason for that is that we don't have any reason to actually take these doubts seriously. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe I'm a brain in a vat, but there's nothing to suggest that it's very likely, right? But implicit bias tells us something different. Learning about implicit bias tells us that we're almost certainly making mistakes, quite a lot of them. And so because of that, because it's telling us not just raising a possibility that we might be making mistakes, it's giving us good reason to believe we're making mistakes. That makes it, in some sense, stronger than traditional forms of skepticism. Now, of course, it's also weaker, because it's not going to lead me to think that maybe all of this is a dream. Maybe the external world doesn't exist. So it is weaker in that sense. It can't lead us to believe we're mistaken about everything. But it can lead us to believe that we might be mistaken about quite a lot, and things that we were pretty confident of. Okay. But again, traditional skepticism seems like it's much more sweeping than that. It can make us doubt the existence of the whole external world. Now, we can't do that with implicit bias skepticism, but nor is it easily contained. It's not like we just discovered that we're bad at making judgments about probability. Because then we can recognize when we're making judgments about probability and get someone else to help us with those, or look up the techniques. Implicit bias could be affecting us whenever we're dealing with someone whose social group we recognize or think we recognize. Whenever somebody makes an argument, we think we're assessing the argument, but we might be influenced by their social group. Whenever a scientist presents some evidence, we think we're assessing the evidence, but we might be influenced by the social group. Much of our knowledge, in fact, comes from testimony of others, from believing things other people say, or it comes from accepting the arguments they present to us, accepting the evidence they've given us. And we probably don't even remember where we got most of our beliefs. We don't know. We can't go back and see, did I get that? Did I, deny what that person said? And could I have been influenced by their social group when I did that? We don't really remember where we got all of those beliefs. So many, many, many of our beliefs could have been affected at some point along the way. And I think that should lead us to something that is at least similar to a very disturbing form of skepticism. Another way in which I think it's more disturbing and more interesting than traditional skepticism is that traditional skepticism doesn't really make you feel like you've got to do anything. Even if you became convinced you really were a brain in a vat, what would you do differently? Right? You're doing about as well as you can in your vat world, But when you learn about implicit bias, you don't think, oh yeah, I'm doing about as well as I can. That's all right. Right? You think you should go on and do something and try to change. So there's a demand for action. Fortunately, there are things that you can do, as you've seen. And I think one thing that's interesting about the action that you need to do, some of it is stuff you can do on your own. Like you can think, I'm going to look at some pictures of counter-stereotypical exemplars. And in fact, some of the psychologists who work on this work in offices surrounded by images of members of groups that they know themselves to have stereotypes about. Okay. Some of that you can do that way. But a lot of it requires non-individual action. What you need is to change the way things in your society are structured. You need to change procedures so that things are anonymized, or you need to change your social world more broadly so that you don't have just people from mainly one social group in your workplace. And that's the only way that you can overcome these doubts about what you know. And I think that's a really interesting result, that considering skeptical doubt could lead to a demand to change the way that the social world is structured. So that's the second way that philosophy can tell us something interesting on the basis of implicit bias. The third thing I'm going to discuss is perhaps more obvious. I'm not sure. Which is that implicit bias gives us a new argument for affirmative action. So traditional arguments for affirmative action tend to take one of two forms. They'll be arguing that affirmative action is needed because this social group has been wronged in the past and we need to make up for it now. Or arguing that affirmative action is needed in order to have positive role models for members of this group, this stigmatized group. And so the focus in both of those cases is on helping members of the underrepresented groups, either by redressing past wrongs against them or by giving them positive role models. Traditionally, what affirmative action policies are, there are actually a lot of different things that get described as affirmative action, but the most controversial ones are ones which would allow you to do something like this. So less controversially, and this one's legal under British law now, if you've got two candidates of equal merit, you can favor the candidate who's from an underrepresented group. The second one is not legal under British law, which is if you have two candidates who meet the minimum criteria for a job but are not of equal merit, You can favor the candidate from an underrepresented group even if they're less well qualified in terms of merit. So on both of these understandings, and this is a traditional way of understanding affirmative action, it involves modifying or deviating from the standard practice that we have, which is evaluating candidates just on their merits and choosing the candidate with the greatest merit. Now, implicit bias changes both how you should understand affirmative action and how one can argue for it, I think. So the way that you get an argument for affirmative action out of implicit bias is by looking at the fact that counter-stereotypical exemplars can help everyone to be less influenced by implicit biases. And we've seen implicit biases lead to errors in all kinds of different ways. So if we want to be making fewer errors, if we want to be better reasoners, making better decisions, we should have more counter-stereotypical exemplars around because they will make all of us better reasoners. Now what's interesting about that is appointing counter-stereotypical exemplars for that reason isn't just about helping the members of the underrepresented groups. It's about helping everybody to be a better reasoner, a better thinker, and a better decision maker. So it's meant to help everyone be less affected by implicit bias. Okay, so it's a very different kind of argument. It's not just about helping members of underrepresented groups. It also shows that we need to rethink what affirmative action is doing. You don't want to describe it as deviating from our standard practice of merit-based appointment, because what the results on implicit bias show us is that we were never making merit-based appointments. Our judgments of merit are being influenced by social group, not just merit. Even when we think we're just looking at merit, we're very bad at that. So the standard appointment procedures weren't merit-based. It's not a deviation from merit-based procedures. Now, I want to emphasize I'm not here arguing that implicit bias research shows that we should practice affirmative action of this sort. That's an argument that can be made, and some people have made it. I think it's more complicated to make that argument. But what I think implicit bias research shows, and what philosophers can draw from it, is that we have a new argument for affirmative action and a new way of understanding affirmative action that we wouldn't have had without implicit bias. So what I hope I've shown is that philosophy helps us to illuminate implicit bias because it helps us think through these tricky issues of blame. It shows us just how worried we should be about the state of our knowledge on the basis of implicit bias. And it helps us to think through the policy implications of learning about implicit bias. So, that's it.